welcome everyone to this session of the Virtual Island Summit, Clean Energy Development and Integrated Resource Planning in Island States, with our hosts, Ricardo, Energy and Environment. My name is James Ellsmore. I'm the organizer of the Virtual Island Summit, and I'm just here to introduce you to our speakers or moderator today. From Ricardo, Energy and Environment, we have firstly Jessica Leigh, who will be leading the session and introducing our other amazing speakers who are all will also be joining. So Jessica is the principal consultant with Ricardo Energy Environment and leads their Sustainable Islands work. Ricardo Energy Environment offers integrated cross-sector services for islands, which encompasses local energy, electricity, sustainable transport, climate change, waste, and resource management. So they have a suite of different skills which they're basing their expertise on. And we have a range of speakers coming from different institutions from parts of the Caribbean and other island states. So with that, Jessica, I'll invite you to come onto the screen and over to you.
Great.
Thank you.
Can you see me? Great. Thank you very much, James. It's a pleasure to be here today at the Virtual Island Summit for this session. As many of you know, islands face a multitude of unique challenges in today's world. These challenges consist of things like historical dependence on costly imported fossil fuels to meet their energy needs. Island states are particularly vulnerable to climate change and especially rising sea levels, changes in ocean temperatures. And island states have a very strong need for resiliency of their island systems in light of things like extreme weather events, hurricanes, and also other emerging global threats. Diversification of island economies is another challenge that could not be more important, especially as tourism and hospitality sectors are hit very hard by the global pandemic. This is something that absolutely needs to be addressed. However, with challenge, there also always comes opportunity. In this moment in time, islands have a very unique opportunity to embrace clean energy and to transition to sustainable systems. Clean energy can provide numerous benefits, including things like energy security and energy independence, greater resiliency and adaptability. It can also support local economic development. It can reduce costs for local industries, businesses, and individual end-use consumers. Clean energy, of course, has a fundamental role as well in combating climate change and also reducing other negative environmental effects. Ricardo Energy Environment has supported island states all around the world at very different stages of development. We've supported them with clean energy planning, regardless of where they are in the process. We've worked with states in the Pacific region, in the Caribbean, in the Indian Ocean, in the Atlantic, and also closer to our home headquarters in the UK. We've worked with numerous Scottish islands and also British Isles. So our session today is going to showcase some of the best practices and lessons learned that we've experienced so far in relation to clean energy development and planning. We're also going to look to the future and imagine what that may be like and talk a bit more about the future of integrated resource planning. I'm very fortunate to be joined by an excellent panel of speakers today. So I'll just take the opportunity to introduce them briefly now. Our first speaker will be Jean-Michel Parle, who is a generation expansion engineer with the Caribbean Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency. Jean-Michel will be speaking today about the importance of clean energy planning in small island states. Next, we will have Nigel Burgess, who is Senior Manager of Electricity Analysis and Planning at the Regulatory Authority of Bermuda. Nigel will be speaking today about Bermuda's experience with integrated resource planning in terms of challenges they faced, solutions found to date, and also share best practices. Next, we will have Dr. Curtis Boodoo, who is currently Assistant Professor of the Utilities Engineering Unit at the University of Trinidad and Tobago. Curtis is also Chairman of the CARICOM Electric Vehicles Working Group, and he will be speaking today about the future of electromobility in the Caribbean. Finally, we have Thomas Amram, who is Principal Consultant with Ricardo. He is also a chartered engineer and an expert in renewable energy and regulatory frameworks for small island states. Tomo will be speaking today about the evolution of IRPs and future implications for cross-sector planning. So a welcome to all of our panelists, and also a very warm welcome to all of our audience who's joining us today. We know you're dialing in from all around the world, and we're very happy to have you with us. Just a quick note on the structure of our session before we dive into the presentations. So we will start with 2 presentations, followed by a short Q&A session. Then we'll have 2 further presentations, followed by a final Q&A session. So there are essentially 2 opportunities to ask questions to the panelists. As hopefully you figured out by now, there is a chat box to the right of your screen. So please introduce yourselves, leave us comments. There are also a number of polls that we've listed under the polls tab. It would be great if you could just take a moment to fill those in. It gives us more information about the audiences with us today and how we can best engage with you. Also, please send us your questions at any point during the presentations, and we will try to address as many as possible in the panel discussions. So without further delay, I will turn over now to Jean-Michel for our first presentation on the importance of clean energy development in small island states.
Thanks for the kind introduction, Jessica. I'm just going to bring up my presentation. Give me 1 second. All right, I hope that's visible to everybody. Okay. 1 second. All right, greetings, everybody. We'll jump right into the presentation. First off, before I begin, I'd just like to convey apologies from Dr. Gary Jackson, our Executive Director of the CCREEE. You may have noticed he was on the agenda before, but some unforeseen circumstances arose and he had to pull out of the session. So I'm here today to sit in on his behalf and hopefully do the presentation justice. So a little background on the CCREEE for those of you who don't know the CCREEE. We're an institution of CARICOM. We were operationalized in May 2018, and we're the regional implementation hub for sustainable energy and the CSIRMs. If you don't know, that's the CARICOM Sustainable Energy Roadmap and Strategy. And we support low carbon energy futures. I would say we have a regional scope, but national focus. Those of you from or familiar with islands would know that islands are blessed with many things, but we also have many challenges that we have to overcome. I'm sure many of them will be discussed at this summit, but for today's purposes on my own, I'm just going to introduce you to 3 of them, and I'm going to use them as a launch pad for some of the initiatives of the CCREEE. So you'll see them in acronyms right next to the challenges. Fear not, I'll be going into them in the next few slides. The first, resilience, or really the lack thereof. Resilience is a hot topic now. It's also a broad one. Today, I'll be introducing you to resilience, in particular in the electricity sector, forgive me. Second, project development, or poor project development. Moving from concept to implementation has been a difficult challenge for the region to overcome for many years. And I hope to introduce you to an initiative that we are developing that we think can assist with this. Lastly, a lack of data, knowledge, and capacity throughout the region. This is not unique to our region either, and this being an island summit, it would be familiar to many people, in particular in small islands, where gathering and developing data and capacity can be difficult, as well as retaining it. So moving on from these challenges, I'll move into some possible solutions. I will start with some background on integrated resource planning. I'm not going to spend too long on IRPs. I think some of you might have a basic familiarity with them. I'll say they are traditional planning tools used for long-term planning in the electricity sector, right? And in basic terms, they ensure that we can meet our long-term needs in an optimal manner. And just to be clear, long-term typically refers to decades, and optimality here is typically economic optimality, aka least cost, meeting our needs as efficiently as possible over the long term. But you probably would have noticed 2 slides ago, I didn't have IRP in brackets, I had IRRP, right? And I'll go into that a little bit. So long-term plan is an iterative process, right? And I think that when planning for decades in particular, we have the obligation to go back periodically and examine the assumptions that feed into our planning processes. We have the obligation to look at some of the projections we've used that may have now deviated from reality. And of course, we're always supposed to be monitoring our environment and seeing what changes are occurring there, right? This may not be a change. I mean, the Caribbean, we're no strangers to risk whatsoever, but we might have also observed that these risks appear to be increasing, right? And that trend is actually supported by scientific data and is widely accepted. So what do we do in the face of that, right? We have to respond by building resilience into our processes, all our processes really, but again, I'm here to speak to electricity sector planning. So how do we do that into something like an IRP, right? It's not just in a name. It would require things like the integration of hazard, vulnerability, and exposure analyses. It would require us to pull climatic data and also look at climatic change scenarios that are being developed. And it requires a shift of perspective from least cost to least regret. And I'm not suggesting that we toss costs out the window. It's still very important. However, the least regret perspective takes into account what I've just mentioned, hazards and vulnerabilities, but in addition, other factors like the policy, social, and environmental ones. And lastly, a more inclusive approach to stakeholder engagement, right? You might notice that none of the 2 things I would have mentioned there could be achieved without widening or expanding the table that typically exists in an IRP process. You might notice that would typically include people like the regulator, the utility, energy agencies, government agencies dealing with energy. Now you have to expand that to include potentially people like offices of climate change, perhaps Met offices, offices of disaster preparedness. So you see that the stakeholder engagement becomes a much more inclusive endeavor. But inclusivity is not just on the stakeholder side, it's on the delivery side as well. It's hard to deliver projects like this by yourself. And CCREEE benefits from wide-ranging partnerships. The CCREEE's IRRP program benefits from the generosity of the GIZ and its CLIRES program. We benefit from the data knowledge and technical capacity of the Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology, who's one of our technical partners. We benefit from the foundation laid by, the support from, and the high-level coordination done by the CARICOM Secretariat, who's one of our key partners, and of course, member states. And right now we're working with Belize, Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, and hopefully we aim to be up and running in Jamaica and St. Lucia next year. This is an IRRP flowchart. Due to time, I'm not going to go through this in detail. I'd just like to point out 3 things I think are important. Number 1, we view the IRRP as a vehicle for stakeholder capacity building, right? This is not to say we expect to make experts out of people taking part in the process in one iteration of the IRP. However, we do believe that it is incumbent on us to begin to develop the capacity of the region. And that's on both sides. That could be the policymaker side. It could also be the technical stakeholders who are part of the process. It could be as simple as allowing them to engage more deeply with the process, or as it regards the technical stakeholders, actually become more involved in taking over some of these analyses in the future, right? Second would be, you'd note there are 2 boxes on collection of data, particularly as it relates to hazard and vulnerability data. I'd like to point out this is really layered in through many points of the process. It doesn't just feed down into one, right? Once for a planning process as broad and as large as the IRP, it really has to feed in at multiple levels. Lastly, bottom right, you'll notice there's implementation, monitoring and evaluation, and then this feeds back into iterating and setting the IRP objectives the next cycle. It's the steps I just mentioned, they're actually critical but often overlooked steps, right? And the CCREEE hopes with some of our programs, our long-term presence in the region, and our future work, we can support member states in making sure that these parts are no longer overlooked, but actually done after the IRP as we move from planning to implementation. So connecting the dots between the others. As much as I'm excited to be part of the IRP program, because that's what I do at the center, I'm equally excited about the strategic coordination I think we're establishing across our key programs, right? And we believe they should really work in tandem to ensure that we overcome the region's challenges, those I mentioned a few slides ago. So beyond the IRRP, there's the Caribbean Energy Knowledge Hub. We affectionately just refer to it as the Knowledge Hub, and our project preparation facility. Everything we do is built on a foundation of comms and PR as well. Comms and PR supports all the other programs. I really love this visual. I'll just speak to it quickly because I think it illustrates what we see as the fact that for us to hit the mark and be successful and overcome these challenges, it really requires a multi-pronged approach. We believe all these programs really have to be successful for us to be successful. So just to quickly wrap up, I'm going to speak about two of these because I think it's really important to show the linkages between them and the IRP, but also see why I think these are great programs. A little about the PPF. The Project Preparation Facility is really about supporting member states in moving from plan to implementation. This is really critical. We realize that planning and implementation require different approaches, right? Hence a dedicated PPF. If I had to break it down to three things, I'd say number one, there's the concrete actions that are going to happen in country and with country stakeholders to help them move from planning outcomes in processes like IRPs, to move from concepts and to move from identified needs to practical and bankable projects. Next, I'd say there's a regional pipeline, right? The regional pipeline will give visibility to these same projects, attract financiers and funding, but also create economies of scale where none exist, another challenge for small islands. Lastly, there's a matchmaking. The match would hopefully be made between these high quality projects coming out of the pipe, ready for investment, and investors. And lastly, the Knowledge Hub. Lastly, but not least, CCREEE's Knowledge Hub is the answer to the challenge of limited knowledge, data, and capacity in the region. There's a symbiotic relationship between this and the other two programs, right? It really sits on the foundation created by the IRP. It's informed by the data and insights gathered therein, and it will highlight common challenges, yes, but we also hope it will also showcase unique approaches to solving those challenges. The PPF, it has its own concrete activities, but we also hope that the project proponents and investors can benefit from the Knowledge Hub. They'll be able to gain insights on things like best practices, market intelligence, and regulatory analysis, just for three. Lastly, I think on a broader scale, it's going to help strengthen the capacity of stakeholders across the region. It's going to give them knowledge, tools, training, and facilitate exchanges between them. I know this was a quick program. I know this was a quick overview. Thank you for listening to the brief overview of the IRRP, but also the suite of programs we see building on its foundation, linking with it, and hopefully delivering the transformation the region requires. Please check out our website. We just redid it. And also regarding the PPF, look out for more news on it in the last quarter of 2020. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Jean-Michel. We'll now move on to our next presentation, which will be with Nigel Burgess. Nigel will be speaking about Bermuda's experience with integrated resource planning.
Thank you, Jessica. Let me bring up my screen here. Again, thank you, Jessica. So Bermuda has been fortunate enough to have just completed its first integrated resource plan. To give you a little bit about Bermuda, we are approximately 55 square kilometers in size and situated in the Atlantic, about 1,100 kilometers off the east coast of the United States. So our fuel is transported to Bermuda throughout the year, and fuel costs account for approximately 50% of our end user tariffs. Our customer bills are strongly linked to these oil prices. We also experiencing a decrease in the population. And what does this mean? It means there are fewer people to split the utilities revenue requirement. We also use diesel generation to meet our peaking demands. Approximately 96% of our electricity is supplied through our main utility using reciprocating engines and gas turbines. operating mainly on fuel oil. The remaining 4% is provided by renewable energies technologies, mainly in waste to energy and solar PV generation. So prior to the IRP, in 2020, a significant portion of generation capacity was due to be retired, and 56 megawatts of capacity was due to be added through the Utilities North Power Station that was commissioned earlier this year. And also, Bermuda's first utility-scale renewable energy PV plant was granted a license earlier this year as well, and that's due to be online later this year. And throughout the next 20 years, a further 69 megawatts is due to be retired. When we look at our demand forecast over the next 20 years, we see that it's quite stable. So along with the decrease in generating capacity, this was the main driver into establishing an IRP at this time. The forecast is mentioned is stable. So there is a need for generation to replace the generation that's been retired. So some of the key features to our IRP, our methodology was tailored to meet our needs. We developed the candidate technologies and developed the LCOE, levelized cost electricity projections, over that 20-year span. For each year where there was a capacity deficit, the power plants were selected based on their LCOE order. We also included the cost of carbon and PV system costs at social discount rates. In developing the generation scenarios, we looked at two groups, utilizing its existing infrastructure on liquid fossil fuels, and also converting the existing fleet to LNG. There were 4 renewable energy penetration targets set for each group, ranging from 0 to 75%. Of these scenarios, option 1D was ultimately selected with the 75% target. Option 1D was selected based on its balanced scorecard approach. So this option surpassed the 2035 renewable energy and emissions targets set in the electricity policy, achieving 85% versus the 36% which was targeted. It also included the highest energy mix density of all of the scenarios. And a key feature to our IRP and our analysis was that there were stability studies performed on all the scenarios, and to ensure that the system was not compromised. And also, this option avoided the investment in LNG infrastructure. There were challenges faced in developing the IRP. 2 of those were mainly limited renewable energy data, and we accepted this, and that more detailed data would be needed in the future and prior to making a definitive decision. One of the first steps in our IRP was to develop pre-feasibility studies on all the candidate technologies prior to going into soliciting generation. We also stipulated that the IRP should be updated periodically, so that the best and the latest available data can be reflected in that version. We also wish to reconcile conflicting views of various stakeholders. We had groups of the public and stakeholders that encourage renewable energy generation. There are others that would like to maintain the status quo, and also there are others that are promoting more innovative technologies as well. So we engaged in a public consultation process. We received over 400 responses to the initial submission. Now, there was overwhelming feedback to pursue renewable energy, so we incorporated this feedback into the second stage of our analysis. We used a stronger economic dimension given to this analysis. We integrated the social cost of carbon and the use of a social discount rate. Some of the main challenges in implementing the IRP is Bermuda being 55 square kilometers, land is a valuable resource. So the RA took it upon itself to conduct these pre-feasibility studies. We looked at all publicly available land in Bermuda. We identified 6 sites of interest. 4 of those we concluded would be viable for solar PV projects. Those totaled to about 12 megawatts. Offshore wind was also considered in the IRP, and in collaboration with the University of Central Leigh, we considered marine power potential as well. Now, project costs. Now, we wanted to ensure that competition was encouraged through the private sector. and also aim to set a realistic ceiling price. Bermuda, instead being remote, the ceiling price, we don't expect to have the 2 cents per kilowatt hour, which we see in other jurisdictions. We do recognize there will be challenges in the developments. Small sites, you want to get the utility, the scale that you will see on larger projects, and also we look to complement the utility scale projects. We have a feed-in tariff policy that encourages rooftop solar penetration. Now, to conclude, some of the best practices we have seen and experienced throughout the development and implementation of the IRP is that early on in the process, you want to set the frequency of the IRP updates and establish the IRP as a living document. We are fortunate enough to have it in our legislation that the IRP will be updated at a minimum of every 5 years. For the first iteration of the IRP, we expect to do it by year 3. Early on in the process as well, you want to consider the stakeholder views. As mentioned, you will have conflicting views, so you would like to manage them accordingly. Also consider the practical aspects. Consider the land availability, the flood risk, the hurricane risk as well. And also, you want to plan for the complete development process. Ensure that you have provided sufficient time for the public consultation. Their buy-in will be vital to the implementation. During the IRP preparation, avoid setting renewable energy targets that can be overly restrictive in the modeling. It's important to note that our 85% target that was reached was an output to the process and not an input. And also select a range of scenarios that use a balanced scorecard, which recognizes the conflicting priorities. Avoid the use of subjective scoring. Also engage the utility throughout. And again, their buy-in is vital to the success of the implementation. And also, you want to encourage the public understanding and engagement. Advertise, explain, and simplify. Following our publication, we engage in an aggressive media campaign through YouTube videos, through public engagement, and through the roadshows. And thank you for listening, and thank you, Jessica.
Thank you very much, Nigel. At this point, we are going to move into our first Q&A panel discussion. So to the audience, please do send through your questions. We've received a number already. And I'll kick off right now with the first few questions to the panelists, and then we will go to audience questions as well. So my first question to the panel is, what do you believe is the biggest challenge for small island states when developing IRPs, or in fact, IRRPs?
Just on me, I can go first.
Yeah, anyone?
Yeah, sure. I would say it's twofold. I don't know if that's cheating on the question, but I'd say it's data and resources. IRPs, these processes are tremendously data intensive. They call for a lot of data that's not always readily available. Beyond that, there's resources. You may be supported, you may have consultants or agencies supporting you. In country, there's still a resource need, and it can sometimes be underestimated. These are resource intensive and data intensive.
Yes, I totally agree. Jean-Michel. Data was one of our challenges, as we mentioned, and one of the first actions which we have done following the IRP was to engage in those pre-feasibility studies, and also, you must have the legislative framework to enable the IRP development as well. That has been one of our challenges prior to the IRP. However, the Bermuda has taken steps to correct that, and we are where we're here today, and with our first IRP.
Great, thank you.
Jessica, and I think another interesting point to note is that an IRP, a good IRP, must really strike a balance between trying to be overly safe and being overly ambitious. And the key really to strike this balance is to incorporate risk planning and risk mitigation in the IRP itself, not after the IRP, but in the IRP. and also recognizing that the easy decision, relying on existing technologies, on things that the incumbent utility might be comfortable with, is not always the safest decision. And the second thing is to make sure that all the decisions are grounded with evidence, with economic analysis, financial analysis. I mean, Nigel mentioned in his presentation that the 85% was an output to the IRP and not an input, and that's very much the right thing to do, grounding decisions with evidence.
Great. I think we'll move on to our next question. Panelists, feel free to keep your cameras on while we engage in the discussion. So our next question to the panel will be, a lot goes into IRPs, as we all know, but once these are actually developed and finalized, making the real transition to implementation can be quite difficult. So my question to the panel is, how would you recommend to ensure that IRPs move into implementation and the plans are actually put into action?
I can get the ball rolling again. Nigel actually mentioned the stakeholder consultation. I think that's great. I would say that buy-in and acceptance is important, not just when the process is nearing its completion. Something that should actually be discussed and thought about well in advance. You lose that buy-in and acceptance, the plan may, without broad acceptance, be able to move forward and really achieve anything, to be honest. So that I would just end there by saying that, and allow me to give a quick nod back to the program we're developing, which we think can sort of carry the baton on after planning is done and aid states with development of projects.
Yes, agree as well. And also, it's important that you set a realistic plan. First of all, a realistic IRP, and also, you want to plan for its implementation as well. You will have challenges. I'm sure COVID-19 was a major challenge for everyone. But you need to have a plan that's as flexible and that can adjust to those unforeseen challenges.
And really, to add up onto what Nigel and Jean-Michel have just said, that plan, that implementation plan, should form part of the IRP itself. It should be potentially the concluding chapter of the IRP. It's not something you think about after the IRP, it's something you think about whilst you're doing the IRP, because that's an integral part of making decisions and setting the timeline for new projects. You're muted, Jessica.
I think someone has muted me. All right. So our next question to the panel is, given project development risks for renewable energy projects in small island states, how would you recommend that private sector participation is incentivized?
Okay, I can take the lead here, Jean-Michel. So, firstly, you need to de-risk the project as much as possible. And to do that, you need to recognize and identify the risk. For us, we engaged in a pre-feasibility studies, which we was able to identify these risks. That has helped us tremendously. Second, you want to provide mitigation solutions prior to the procurement process. This will all aid in de-risking the project and providing a surety to the bidders. And also, you want to ensure that there's a fair procurement and policy or plan in place. Again, this is to ensure confidence in the bidders. In Bermuda, we are developing our boat generation procurement guidelines and rules, and this will lay out the plan for all the stakeholders to follow and provide them a surety that it will be a fair process in procurement.
And Nigel started off great. I agree with all these points. I'd only add to his that maybe as we do that and as we have facilities that de-risk and also help support the development of projects, that we try to work through some of the major impediments, because I think we need to build some sort of sustainable sustainable participatory mechanism. Like it can't just be supporting or de-risking project by project. I think we actually have to begin to tackle some of, when I'm speaking of our region, we have to begin to tackle some of the major impediments, whether they be resource capacity, ignorance or lack of knowledge in places like the financial institutions for how these projects operate or what the true level of risk is. So I think we begin to tackle it in two prongs, the projects like Nigel said, but also the entire ecosystem.
I would also like to say, Jessica, that a regional approach is essential. And the good work done by CARICOM Energy and CCREEE really adds to contributes to a lower risk when developing renewable energy projects in small islands. When we have such limited resources, when you're able to pool your resources depending on the regional needs, it's much more better business case than looking at a small individual island separately.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and I think a lot of islands, certainly in the Caribbean, but in other regions as well, are really trying to embrace that more. It gets talked about a lot, but you need to kind of move to the next stage with it at this point. All right, so I'm going to take a question from the audience now. This moves beyond the Caribbean region. Question is, in the sea at the east of our island in Crete, we currently have a military standoff about rights to new hydrocarbon exploration. There are also plans for new East Med gas pipeline in the next 5 years. At the same time, Crete is suffering from the early ravages of climate change, which are getting more intense each year. What suggestions do the panelists have about how to effectively lobby against this outdated approach of exploiting fossil fuels instead of fully committing to green energy? Quite a broad question.
I could take a first stab and just say that I think it is broad and it's somewhat challenging, and probably likely political ramifications to it. But I mean, as a starting point, I would just say that there's a lot of data and analysis supporting what I think the direction you want to push is. So I would begin by accessing a lot of that and building a case. And I don't think the case will be tremendously difficult to build. How you actually utilize that case to petition against the direction you see this going. I don't feel qualified to answer that today, but yeah, I would say start by building that case, which has been made in many places around the world as to the right direction you should be going in, both in terms of investment and responsibility for your country and environment.
Yes, probably the other thing to mention is that numbers are increasingly working in the advantage of renewable energy. Even without trying to twist or distort the analysis in any way, the levelized cost of renewable energy is increasingly competitive and is overtaking conventional generation. The one thing that the Bermuda IRP is doing and is quite interesting is that it's also building in expected cost reduction that we can reasonably expect from solar PV, offshore wind power generation in future years, because there's a declining trend when it comes to infrastructure cost for renewable energy as technology improves, as learning improves. And if you're looking at the cost of a solar plant or an offshore wind farm in 2027, then you shouldn't use today as a reference point, because you can reasonably expect improvements and cost reductions for the period between now and when disbursements are needed.
Anyone else like to comment on that? Okay. I have a question specifically for Jean-Michel from the audience. The question is, please comment on how the regret element is fed into the IRRP. This would appear to be a critical factor in moving beyond a narrow economic analysis.
Yeah, sure, not a problem. So as I mentioned before, it's a shifting of perspective, and it's not leaving behind costs by any means. And in fact, in performing an analysis, I guess you still have to have a basis for doing it in a quantitative manner. But I think it's signaling it in that manner is really meant to indicate that doing things on a narrow cost basis for the installation of some of these things may disregard some of the stuff that comes in on the back end. It may disregard the stuff that was listed on the slide, policy, environmental, but also some of the risk factors or the lack of resilience that you really have by going in certain directions. So it's really, I guess if I had to say it in a different way, least regret just means moving to a more resilient mode of operation, down a more resilient future pathway. And that might not be on paper, if you're just looking at it by direct comparison, automatically the least cost pathway. I hope that clarifies it a little bit.
So next question to the panel is, small island states generally have to deal with land scarcity issues. How would you recommend overcoming these challenges when developing clean energy projects?
I can answer that, Jessica. So in Bermuda, being 55 square kilometers, we are very small, and roughly 1% of our land could be dedicated to for renewable energy resources. No, that is very small, and is definitely not enough to provide a solution, overall solution for the island. So we have to look offshore. There are major developments in wind technologies through floating wind, and also there's more technologies coming available through other marine power through wave and tide. And so we will explore these resources here as well. And in Bermuda, we're also developing a sandbox approach, which will allow innovative technologies to come to Bermuda and test their technologies and in the efforts to become commercial viable. So this is a way that we look to be on the forefront and on the innovation side, and be able to foster those for the industry to provide the solutions to our problems which we may face.
And just to add to that, when we're looking at a situation when there's land scarcity, every piece of land counts. So you really need to implement a very systemic approach where you're looking at every single opportunity to develop a project while recognizing challenges of, for instance, proximity to airports, glare risk, and scalability of solar. So that's really important. But in places like small islands, you have to recognize the opportunity cost of the land. Landowners may not be willing to offer the land for solar PV development when they can offer it for development of a hotel, of a touristic complex. And that is very much the reality of the situation. So that's why engagement with landowners is essential to initiate very early on in the process, because it's their land. So their buy-in, whether it's the government, whether it's private landowners, is essential. And you need to recognize that a solar PV plant, for instance, is not the only thing you could build on the land, and they could get a better return with something else. So that process is really critical. And the other thing, of course, is that once you've exhausted public land available, you need to look at buildings. And once you've exhausted utility scale opportunities, you need to promote rooftop solar and consider the threshold that you have for license exemption, for instance, and to consider whether your feed-in tariff policy is aggressive or ambitious enough.
Thank you, Nigel and Thomas. I think at this point, we are going to move on to the next presentations, We are getting lots of great questions, but we have an additional Q&A period at the end, so there'll be opportunity to have more discussion. But at this stage, I'd like to move on to the next presentation, which will be given by Dr. Curtis Boodoo, and he will be speaking about the future of electric mobility in the Caribbean.
Curtis, you're currently muted.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, everyone. I would like to start our discussion this morning regarding with an overall look at the CARICOM region and our use of liquid transportation fuel, and this liquid transportation fuel being imported liquid transportation fuel. So this is a listing of the 15 CARICOM countries or members of CARICOM. Let me just first explain Trinidad and Tobago. So Trinidad and Tobago is a net energy exporter. And we have or used to have a refinery. So that explains the 7.8%. But if you look at the other small islands, you would see that roughly around 40% of their imported fuel, especially this being liquid fuel, goes towards transportation, which is a very high percentage. So there's also an opportunity when you look at your electricity costs versus your gasoline costs in the region. So if you take a look or you focus your attention on Barbados, and Barbados is at the vanguard of electric vehicle deployment in CARICOM, they have one of the highest costs for gasoline in the region at roughly around $6.75 per gallon. Now, the electricity cost, of course, is significantly less, but it's still one of the highest electricity costs you could actually find in the region. So there is the cheaper fuel option, meaning that investing in electric vehicles in the region would be cheaper in terms of the fuel because you're investing in electricity as opposed to the imported liquid transportation fuels, gasoline and diesel. Even though we do have these incentives in the region, we are still faced with a low deployment of electric vehicles. So again, let's just focus on Barbados. Barbados has around 430 electric vehicles currently. Most of them are light passenger vehicles. And this represents roughly, it represents less than 1% of the total number of vehicles in the island, counting the ICE vehicles, the internal engine combustion engine vehicles. And it's the same for Bermuda. Bermuda has around the same number as Barbados, and it's less than 1% of the total deployment. So we as a region really have to look at how do we encourage a greater deployment of electric vehicles. Just focusing on the policy area, investment in clean transportation or policies directed towards clean transportation for the region really started in 2015 when the different territories and countries looked at their NDCs. So quite a number of countries within their first NDCs would have submitted commitments to the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions in the transportation sector. They may not have committed to electric mobility or e-mobility as a policy, but there was a commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in transportation sector. So hopefully when these NDCs would be updated, they would provide more details or be more specific about how they would attain these goals or invest in a certain technology. So clearly there's a need for a regional policy when it comes to e-mobility in the region. And you know, it's important to be aware that ground transportation policies within CARICOM is not as developed when you compare it to your corresponding energy policies or the sustainable energy policies of the different islands. In fact, there are few islands in the region that have a transportation policy. And this is mainly because it's a complex policy to put together. It's highly correlated with energy, tourism, social programs, and of course, urban planning. But there is a need to reduce emissions, especially in the transportation sector. And perhaps a regional focus or regional policy would be most helpful in directing the different territories towards greater deployment of electric vehicles or greater adoption. And this is where the regional bodies really stepped in. So in 2017, late 2017, CARICOM Energy formed the Electric Vehicles Work Group. The Electric Vehicle Work Group, it's a regional work group with stakeholders from throughout the region that belong to different sectors, the transportation sector, energy, finance, etc. And we were tasked with preparing a regional roadmap or strategy focused on electric vehicles. So in late last year, or probably mid last year, the CCREEE really took over this initiative and produced the first electric vehicle strategy framework document. And of course, you could view that document on CCREEE's website. So if you look at the regional electric vehicle strategy framework, our aim is to deliver intelligent, modern, affordable, clean, efficient, and safe mobility solution for CARICOM. This aim is accomplished by what we call 3 strategic imperatives: innovation, intelligence, and electrification. So we're not looking at just simply the electrification of transportation. We are looking at other very important aspects that is essential in an overall sustainable transportation for the region. So we will look at implementing these strategic imperatives in 3 areas: finance and marketing, capacity development, and technology and infrastructure. So I can immediately say to you that when we were putting together the revs for the region, we did very little planning with regards to COVID-19. And COVID-19 and post-COVID-19 would have a serious effect on the region. It is challenging. It is challenging for the region because a lot of the territories rely on tourism. There is also a decrease in automotive sales, and there's also a drop in prices for global liquid fuels, and this could be an impediment for the development of electric vehicles in the region. But we do believe that the REV strategy is robust and resilient to handle this COVID-19 pandemic. I would say that when it comes to policy and regulation, the regional governments may be hesitant to put forward tax incentives for electric vehicles, or they may be even considering to roll back some of the tax incentives that we currently have in the region. I would say that I understand that taxation from new vehicle sales is important, but we should ensure that at least public transportation is encouraged. When it comes to technology and infrastructure, it may be a challenge to ask governments to roll out charging infrastructures at this time. So we would have to look at some sort of partnerships between private sector and, or encourage private sector to really drive this aspect. Where I really see the growth in this region or in this component is where with regards to capacity development and awareness. So there's a need to train our people when it comes to electric vehicle technology and the rollout of charging networks, especially at the technical or technician level. So that need will remain, and that need is even more significant in this pandemic period when we look at diversifying away from our traditional areas, tourism, or in the case of Trinidad, oil and gas. We would have to look at some innovative financing methods. CCREEE is doing an excellent job on that with their project planning initiative. So the work from the regional bodies would be essential when it comes to directing financing in this area, especially innovative financing. Okay, so thank you all for listening, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much, Jessica.
Thank you very much, Curtis. Very interesting presentation. So we will now move on to our final presentation, which will be with Thomas Amram, and he will be presenting about the evolution of IRPs and future implications for cross-sector planning.
Thank you, Jessica, and thank you all. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, very good. So we've had some very good contributions so far. If there's one thing to observe from presentations, especially from the first part of this webinar, is that energy plans have come a long way over the last few decades and have transformed from merely power sector development plans, project analysis, to comprehensive plans looking decades into the future, considering supply side as well as demand side opportunities and constraints, looking at utility scale, centralized power, as well as decentralized power and opportunities. And more recently at plans that have been incorporating resilience planning and the environmental impact of investment decisions. But I would argue that IRPs, as in integrated resource planning, are still very power sector centric at this stage. And that when we look at what the future might hold, which is the main topic of this presentation, there might be more opportunities to fully realize the value of the I in IRP and have a more integrated and cross-sector approach. And there are a number of market disruptors, technology improvements that we see emerging and developing, and that will comfort this approach and effectively enhance and emulate synergies between the various sectors of the economy. So obviously, the power sector plan, the IRP, is primarily looking at electricity, the electricity sector, looking at conventional technologies and obviously more and more renewable energy, and even looking into the future, we'll be considering more technologies such as wave power. But with the emergence of new technologies, there is a nexus, a natural synergy emerging between the electricity and the transport sector. With electricity, obviously, you can power electric vehicles. We've just discussed this, but you can also make green hydrogen from renewable energy and synthetic fuels such as methanol, such as ammonia, that you can use for transportation, not just inland, but also for cruise ships, for ferries, for aviation, for instance, from one island to the other. But we can even look further than this. In countries where this is applicable, it's not going to be applicable to all small island states. There's also a natural nexus and synergies between the agriculture sector and the transport sector, because from agriculture, you can produce biofuels such as methanol, which can in turn be used for the transport industry. But again, that doesn't stop there, because with electricity, you can power irrigation system, processing system, storage system, and conversely, with the byproducts of the agriculture sector, conversion of waste to energy, you can produce electricity through anaerobic digestion, through biomass cogeneration. So already looking not just at one, but 3 different sectors. There's another sector hiding in the background, and that's the water sector. Because you need, in addition to electricity, you need water, desalinated water, to produce hydrogen. And obviously, water is a key element in agriculture and can also be used to produce electricity. So those are the 3-4 sectors that have organic synergies, and that some of the market disruptors that I'm going to introduce in a minute will effectively emulate and bring about. First market disruptor is not just EV, but also vehicle to grid opportunities. When we look at electric vehicle charging, we think of a unidirectional transaction between the grid and vehicle, when we plug the vehicle instantly into the grid. And that's we call slow charging, the most conventional way of charging EVs. Users that use electric vehicles want flexibility, and that's where the facilities of fast charging have emerged. For fast charging, which is charging in about 30 minutes, you need to convert the current from AC alternative to DC direct upstream of the pump, or within the pump itself, but ahead of effectively attaining the vehicle. That is definitely helping the development of EVs, because that gives more flexibility to users. And EVs will be an integral part of the future in small islands, I'm convinced of that, because effectively virtually small islands are in a unique position compared with other places around the world. One, driving range is not as much of an issue as it is in a number of developed markets. And two, the fuel cost that you see in small islands are often very, very high. One of the key barriers to EV implementation beyond upfront cost barriers is effectively the impact that EV charging has on the system. And that's where vehicle-to-grid technologies really step in, because you have to think of batteries in electric vehicles as moving batteries that are batteries that can be used like any other batteries that you've got plugged in directly into the grid. And effectively, you can discharge batteries from electric vehicles straight into the AC grid or indeed into the DC grid. Now, for a number of you, that will sound very abstract and almost like science fiction, but we're actually currently working on a very real-world project that looks at the benefits of vehicle-to-grid in the UK, and we're working with a distribution utility to effectively enhance the implementation of rapid charging across the network. One main issue with rapid charging is that it requires some significant localized locational investment to ensure that there is the capacity on the grid and substations to meet with the very high demand resulting from rapid charging use, which is not always possible, and that is very costly. Now, the main principle of the project DC Share that I'm presenting here is to see whether there would be any benefit in establishing a DC ring, a direct current ring, that would allow to mutualize spare capacity across the network in order to facilitate rapid charging across a number of locations connected to the same DC ring, and optimizing power flow, using power electronics, and hence facilitating rapid charging. So that is something that's worth considering and bring vehicle-to-grid into the real world. Another market disruptor, which is obviously becoming more and more popular and is getting more and more traction, is hydrogen. And hydrogen has tremendous potential to offer more flexibility and more solutions to small islands. So for those of you that are not entirely comfortable with the hydrogen production process, so it can be produced locally. All you need is water, desalinated water, which with the process of electrolysis produces hydrogen, gaseous hydrogen. You chill it and you can store it in the liquid form. Once you've got hydrogen, there's quite a few things you can do with it. One, you can use it directly as primary fuel for transport, for buses, for cruise ships, for inland and maritime transport. Once it's stored, you can convert it back into power. It's not really efficient as it stands, but hopefully it will be in the next few decades, which is the horizon we're looking at here, through fuel cells, through hydrogen power, gas turbines. The also really interesting things that a number of people tend to forget is that once you've got hydrogen, you can do more than just use it as such. You can produce synthetic fuels such as ammonia, methanol, and those are the fuels. They've got a higher energy density than hydrogen itself, and they're very good candidate to power freights, cruise ships, and large maritime ships effectively. Now, one of the key barriers, obviously, is that the costs are quite significant, but the business case improves as you're looking at a wide range of users and users for hydrogen on small islands. A significant opportunity is that hydrogen helps to untap, to use untapped renewable energy potential that the grid cannot absorb on its own. One interesting case study, one project we're currently doing is that we're working with the Isle of Wight, which is in the south of the UK. And Isle of Wight is in an interesting position where they have too much renewable. They're connected to the mainland, and currently they are not allowed to build any more renewable energy on the island due to specifications around the interconnection to the mainland. We're currently working with them to investigate how to diversify energy use across the islands to tap into renewable energy potential. So in a high hydrogen uptake scenario, that means obviously in addition to EVs, not saying that hydrogen is going to overtake EVs, they're likely to be quite complementary to one another. You know, think of a system where you've got hydrogen buses, where you've got ferries running on hydrogen pumps across the island, and the combination of more EV and more hydrogen produced locally, you know, will mean that, you know, we'll be able to tap into more solar project, you know, some offshore wind project or tidal project that, you know, you can't effectively procure at this stage due to grid constraints. So just to recap, I mean, where we see the evolution of IRPs as effectively consisting in going from a system where you're using centralized and decentralized resources to power the main grid in a sort of power sector centric philosophy, to a scheme where, you know, as you build more EV infrastructure, you increase the demand on the grid and you increase potential for renewable energy projects. And with this increased potential, you can not only power electric vehicles, you can produce hydrogen that can be used for industry purpose, distilleries, for instance, and that can be used to power aviation, transport, cruise ships as primary fuel. You can also produce synthetic fuels from hydrogen, again, for instance, the shipping industry. Synthetic fuels, you know, such as eLNG could potentially substitute to some extent to some of the fossil fuels, and the spare hydrogen can be converted back into power, theoretically. And just to bring that into perspective, you know, that's typically an example of an island where this vision is effectively represented, where you have effectively you know, hydrogen production locally on the island, in addition to EV charging with vehicle to grid options and features. That hydrogen locally produced is used for, you know, say cruise ships, ferries traveling from one part of the island to the other, hydrogen buses, why not? And that means more opportunity for projects. Obviously, rooftop solar, more solar projects, and offshore wind, more offshore wind than currently planned, and wave power. So that's the vision of the future that we're trying to defend, and certainly that we think is very promising. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas. At this point, we will move into our final panel discussion. So we've received a lot of questions already, but please continue to send them through. As before, I'm going to kick off with the first question, and then we will take other questions from the audience. We've talked a lot about the benefits of cross-sector planning in the second portion of this panel. I'd like to know, how would you recommend overcoming practical barriers and silos when we have traditionally separate sectors such as energy, transport, agriculture that are not necessarily used to collaborating extensively? How would you recommend overcoming those barriers and silos?
For me, I mean, it's an excellent question, but I know no better way than bring the stakeholders from the sectors together. I'm not suggesting to just throw them in a room and lock them away. But I mean, some scene setting will be required, setting the context for why their industries are important to feed into the process of energy and electricity sector planning. I think once you set that down, I'm pretty confident that most professionals actually find it an exciting concept, something like what Thomas just presented, how their industries may become electrified, change in the future, modernize. And I actually feel most people are excited to contribute to a cross-sectoral planning process like that. Once you bring them together, you start the discussions and you set the scene properly. So it may be a simple answer, but I think just bring them together and set the scene properly and allow them to feed into the process.
I think the challenge, first and foremost, is of a political nature. For as long as you have the Agency for Transport developing a transport plan, the electricity regulator or the Ministry of Energy developing an electricity plan, and the Agency for Agriculture developing a plan for waste, then that's not going to work. There needs to be a joint approach between all of those sectors that have synergies with one another, to develop a common strategy, and that means that, you know, having a collaborative approach between different agencies across various sectors, that's essential, because an electricity regulator is not empowered, does not have the legal mandate to say that, you know, there will be X numbers of EVs in the island in the next 20 years. So it either needs to be cascaded or preferably a joint approach where all the relevant agencies are working together.
I believe in Bermuda, we have taken those early steps as well. So in 2019, the government developed a transportation green paper, and that was to gauge the public's interest and help them to formulate the transportation policy. Also, in the development stages of our IRP, you know, all the utility, which offers the first, the IRP proposal, the first draft, as you may know, they must engage in all potential stakeholders which may provide have demand for the electricity needs in the future. Also, Bermuda is looking forward to the electrification of its public transportation fleet. Now, so there has been increased engagement between the transportation sectors, the regulatory authority, the RA, and the utilities. So those steps are on the way. And as Jean-Michel mentioned, you know, that collaboration is definitely needed to come up with an overall plan.
Yeah, I would like to say, Jessica, if you look at the region at the ministerial level, or the level for the countries where we have the different ministries, they typically separate transport and energy. So a country would have a Ministry of Transport, and you would separately have a Ministry of Energy. So collaboration should be encouraged at really at the highest level of government when you look at the different ministries.
This ties into one of the audience questions that's come through in moving towards a more cross-sector approach. Which agency do you think should lead the process?
I don't think there should be one single agency taking ownership of the full process if it encompasses several sectors and is no longer sector-centric. You can imagine the setup of a task force where all the agencies, all the relevant agencies are represented, and where they work collaboratively. Now, because we're looking at power generation, there is a strong power generation component to it. But if we start saying that the electricity regulator or Ministry of Energy will make decision on behalf of departments for transport or for agriculture, this is not going to go down really well, and certainly not going to have the buy-in of all the stakeholders. So I think a task force like setup is probably the most relevant and probably the wisest approach.
Yeah, just add to that. I don't have a clear answer, or rather I should phrase it differently in that I think it's very context dependent on the place you're working in. So I would follow on from what Thomas just said by saying task force approach, and or perhaps to at least, again, by setting the scene and getting an understanding, you may have a better driving force or driving agency in a particular context. You could at least start to get some basic required framework setup and then move into an inclusive task force type approach. But yeah, it's really contextual. You know, with a broad listenership like today, I wouldn't want to give a single prescriptive way about this.
Yeah, there's definitely not one answer to that question. There's no one size fits all solution to it. It depends on the context. I completely agree with that. Okay, moving on to another question for the panel. This relates specifically to the Caribbean region, but might be more broadly relevant as well. How do you think the emphasis on CNG in some states in the Caribbean will impact the trajectory of transitioning to electric vehicles?
Hi, Jessica. I could probably start first. Before I start, I just want to add a point that investment in CNG is not the efficient use of natural gas. So when you compare you using your natural gas to create electricity that will charge and that energy will be used in electric vehicles, if you look at the other side of the technology by using a natural gas, compressing it and using it for CNG, CNG is not the most efficient way to use your natural gas. Investment in electric vehicle technology is. However, that said, there's still a considerable number of ICE vehicles in the region, internal combustion engine vehicles, and these vehicles will be around for some time. So there is most definitely a need to provide a cleaner fuel for these vehicles. And perhaps CNG is the answer. CNG is, or natural gas is a fuel that is gaining more popularity in the Caribbean region. We have it present in Guyana. We have certainly a lot of natural gas interest in Jamaica, and this is besides Trinidad. So I think it should be clear that the CNG technology or the investment in CNG as a fuel should be a transitionary fuel. And the long-term solution would be electric vehicles or even vehicles powered by hydrogen.
Okay, great, thank you. Another audience question. Do these new developments in cross-sector planning mean that prospects will improve for maritime transport, such as ferries, as an alternative to air travel between islands, or will weather conditions, such as hurricane season, hinder this?
I think it's worth mentioning that hydrogen and synthetic fuels to be produced from hydrogen could be both relevant to the aviation and the maritime transport sectors. So I guess we're not saying that the maritime transport will overtake the aviation. Actually, there are some promising developments that we're also currently working on in Ricardo around use of synthetic fuels for the aviation industry. So no, they're still meant to be complementary. I guess the one thing I would say to nuance the presentation and my response is that I wouldn't pretend having or trying to read through a crystal ball at this stage. Then there are obviously quite a number of uncertainties when it comes to market disruptors. Otherwise, they would be called new technologies. And so what we're saying here is saying that those technologies, those market disruptors, are potentially quite promising for small islands. How they will actually be used in the future, well, we'll have to wait for the technology to develop, for more pilot projects like the ones I've mentioned to be done and prove the full potential of those technologies, and in which circumstances more precisely they're most beneficial, and in which circumstances the business case is most attractive.
I just add one thing to that. It's a great answer. I'd just say that let's not forget it wouldn't automatically follow on. I think we do have a lot of impediments in the region that affect both our air and sea transport links. Unfortunately, I think without those being rectified, it would not immediately follow on that any technological development would feed into automatic sea links being developed, let's say. So I think we have a lot of other impediments to overcome that are probably more significant, political, regulatory, and as just mentioned, making an adequate business case for these links.
Yeah, I would say that there is the potential for indigenous maritime transport, meaning in the region, there are a lot of states that are multiple island states. So take, for example, the Trinidad and Tobago. So we belong to the same jurisdiction. And the distance between these small islands is within the current deployment of electric ferries, or within the technological reach of current deployment of electric ferries. So there is an opportunity in the small islands when we have multiple states for the deployment of electric vehicle technology in the maritime, indigenous maritime sector.
All right, another question from the audience for the panel. How will hydrogen be generated? Most of the initiatives at this time depend on hydrocarbons as feederstock or power. Are there alternatives that are economically viable without state subsidies?
This one is probably for me. I mean, yes, there are different ways of producing hydrogen, and as mentioned rightly so in the question, the most common ways to produce hydrogen at the moment is by the use of effectively hydrocarbons. Now, the vision that we were discussing over the course of the presentation I gave is the vision that focuses on green hydrogen. So where hydrogen is produced locally from renewable energy generation, where all the power requirements that are involved in the production of hydrogen, from desalination requirements to electrolysis to storage and others, are powered through renewable generation. Now, is that commercially viable today? No. Is there potential for this to become commercially viable and competitive in the next decades? Absolutely, yes. Because there's a virtuous cycle here, where as renewable generation prices decrease, the cost of producing hydrogen from renewable generation decreases as well, and also you can use spare capacity that you have, around lunchtime potentially from renewable generation, and any power that is otherwise curtailed, and you can convert that and use to produce hydrogen. So there is a strong business case today. It will become stronger in the next decade, and hopefully commercially viable in the next few years. But we're really looking, a couple of decades away. But those are things that you start preparing from now, because if you decide to invest into 50 megawatt, 60 megawatt of LNG infrastructure today, then you can no longer revert back to hydrogen in 10 years' time when it becomes hopefully commercially viable. So it's about looking at those opportunities down the line, and making sure that the decisions of today do not impede effectively the very serious opportunities of tomorrow.
Yes, Jessica, I would say that there is actually a great opportunity for the region when it comes to green hydrogen. So there are quite a number of small islands, the OECS islands, that have a significant amount of geothermal resource, which they are currently developing or they are looking at developing. So there's a lot of spare capacity with regards to these islands, and they're very close together. So there is certainly a opportunity in the region to use this spare capacity from geothermal energy for the use of hydrogen, or the development of a hydrogen economy, especially around the OECS countries.
Great, thank you. We have time for just a couple more questions, and then we will wrap up. So a question from the audience: can you please address the IRP process when many islands are under a single source privately held power provider agreements? How does an IRP consider that any decrease in volumetric sales will decrease profitability, often which is guaranteed to the power provider?
And I can take a first step with that, Jessica. So the first step is to establish an enabling framework to allow for competition in in the generation market, and that's what Bermuda has done. Bermuda has traditionally been under a solely integrated provider. Now generation is open to competition. In Bermuda now, there's still one transmission, distribution, and retail licensee. However, again, generation is open to the competitive market. And again, the policies and legislative framework has enabled that recently. And also, again, is to establish that there will be a fair process for any potential bidders to come in. Again, having the utility there, it could be a sense of, a foregone conclusion. However, the RA has looked to establish and provide confidence to bidders that there will be a fair process, and by potentially uprunning the procurement process in itself. So again, that is the first step to enabling competition can take place.
The one thing I'd like to add to that is that alongside the development of doing IRPs, and I understand the sense of the question, because the incumbent utility traditionally has been developing power generation and making profit from that. So how do you make sure that the development of IRPs and with more private sector participation doesn't impede the profitability or indeed the financial sustainability of the utility? One regulatory instrument that sits alongside IRPs and many other is price setting and having robust rate setting framework that obviously are independent from the IRP process altogether. That's something we've worked quite a lot on in Ricardo in a number of small island states. So making sure that you've got regulatory frameworks in place for the utility to set cost reflective rates that reflect a reasonable rate of return in order to alleviate any concerns that they may have in seeing private sector jumping in, because the integrity and their financial sustainability absolutely needs to be protected. Actually, it sometimes is one of the explicit mandates of regulators in the legal framework: protect the financial sustainability of stakeholders involved.
Just a quick addition. I'm happy Nigel kicked it off, because I think that was quite the right way to set the scene. I think, yes, regulation has to be there to ensure that the outcomes of the IRRP, they're number one, able to be pursued, or really that they can work with the market. I mean, you can conduct, I think the way the question was phrased, how can you conduct? You can conduct an IRP in the absence of it, or in the case of a single vertically integrated utility controlling the market, but it might not amount to much. I mean, it might just be a power sector plan, and without their buy-in, it might not go anywhere. So yeah, it's basically likely leading with regulation and understanding what that market is supposed to look like and feeding the exact circumstances into the IRP.
So I think James, do we have time for one last question?
Yeah, please continue.
Great, thank you. So one last question. How do we best utilize this event and community to accelerate the build out of advanced technologies in holistic solutions for all island communities?
Hi, Jessica, if you don't mind, I could probably start first on this. From my experience, from working on projects in the region, there is little collaboration between the different small island regions. Or there's a lot of opportunity to increase collaboration. So we do a lot of work within the region here in CARICOM between the small islands, but we don't necessarily collaborate with our colleagues or friends from the Pacific. So there should be more collaboration between small island states, or the regions that these small island states belong to.
I guess it would be remiss of me not to speak, since I'm from the Caribbean Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency, and we're part of a global network of centers just like ourselves. So I do believe there are some frameworks that allow collaboration across the world for people in similar circumstances. As well, we do interact with other small island developing states through some of the other programs like SIDS-DOC, so on. So there's structures in place as to how the average person can. I mean, I think participation in things like this is good. We get to spread the message, the knowledge, the understanding. People get to learn more. I think informed participation is a great thing. So I don't know if the question is from the perspective of the invitees today, the people who are listening in, or on a higher level, but hopefully I spoke to both. I guess inform yourselves, participate. I think that's very important. So.
Also, one of the biggest assets to these type of arenas is that it highlights the challenges which the the islands face. And again, the industry is there to provide solutions, and us being able to provide have a platform to openly display these challenges. The industry will provide those solutions and contact the appropriate agencies to deal with them.
Great, thank you very much. I think one thing that has certainly come up a lot in this discussion, it's very important, we need to get better at sharing around the world best practices in forums like this and through other types of partnerships. And then on the other side, that there just really is not one-size solutions to these complex problems. And local stakeholders in individual islands need to be a pivotal and essential part of the solution. Without that, there's going to be no sustainable solutions long-term. So it is really important that we communicate, and it is really important that we bring the best that we can from all sides to the table, and really think about what type of future we want to have and what we need to do to get there. So I think we are just over time now, but thank you so much to all of our panelists. Really excellent presentations and very, very interesting conversation. Thanks very much to our audience for joining us. We're really happy to have had you with us. We received so many good questions, and we'd really love to continue the conversation over the course of this week and beyond. So please continue reaching out to us, and happy to discuss with many of you in more detail on some of these questions. Thank you also to James and all of the Virtual Island organizers. It has been an absolute pleasure to be here today.